Hey everybody, now that we've looked at the geographical and physical features of Gautama's world in Part A, we're going to look at the religion and culture that existed at his time. I've included on the title slide here an image of Gautama leaving home in the middle of the night after he realizes that he has to forsake his life of luxury in order to find liberation. When Gautama leaves home, he's also leaving behind the religion, the worldview, and the social structure that prevailed during his time. It's that religion and worldview that we're going to discuss in this lecturette. In Part A, we referred to the Indus Valley Civilization and its decline, and then later the coming of the Aryans. Now, in Trainer and in some other sources, you'll find reference to a debate about whether the Aryans were a people who originated in India, in other words, that they might be descendants of those Indus Valley people, or whether they were another group that came to prominence after the Indus Valley's decline, or whether they were migrants who came from outside. This is important for Hindu politics today, but for most Western scholars, this is not a serious debate. The Aryans did migrate from outside of India, but once they came, thousands of years ago, they created a splendid civilization that blended with the indigenous culture to create what we would now call Hinduism. I also talked in Part A about the term Aryan and how the term was misused by Nazis and by white supremacists. But now we have to unpack the word even further because the Buddha himself did that. As the term was used in ancient times, it had the meaning of noble, and all the peoples who were called Arya, whether they were in India or Iran or Ireland, they used this term because they wanted to call themselves noble. But in India, the term Arya had become specifically identified with the community of priests and literate ritual specialists who controlled the sacrificial fire ritual. And this community, you probably know the word already, were called Brahmins. Because they maintained the central ritual of the society, they were also in a position to declare what the ideals of the entire society would be. These ideals were known collectively as dharma, the right, or the good. And if you remember our previous lecturettes, you know that the Buddha used this in a different way. So, before we move on, I'd like you to keep in mind these two words, Aryan and Dharma, terms which are deeply embedded in the worldview of Brahmins. Gautama Buddha would later take these terms and give them new meanings, which challenged the Brahmin worldview. Rulers, usually from the community of warriors or kshatriyas, hired Brahmin priests to perform the powerful rituals that kept their kingdoms strong and victorious. But it was also the role of Brahmins to implement a society-wide vision of religious values and obligations for all the communities within the kingdom. The chief idea of the sacrifice was to win the favor of the gods for the good of the sponsor of the sacrifice. But the symbolism of the sacrifice, based on its ritual actions, was extremely rich. Let's look at this and introduce some new terms in the study of religion. When we talk about the fundamental actions of a ritual or any type of religious situation, we can speak of its quote-unquote phenomenology. Phenomenology simply means what it means as a phenomenon. The phenomenology of the sacrifice is, first of all, that it creates hospitality. It creates vertical hospitality by which humans invite the gods to share their offerings, as well as horizontal hospitality. What do we mean by horizontal hospitality? After the gods consume the spiritual part of the sacrifice, human beings share the sacrificed animal or the fruits or the grains with each other. Another aspect of the phenomenology of the sacrifice is the preparation of the sacrificial offering. Things found in nature are transformed to make them worthy of the gods. Animals are cut up and rearranged on the altar, and they're cooked on the fire, which further alters them and makes them more acceptable to the gods. And of course, for horizontal hospitality, it makes them more appetizing to the humans who share the sacrifice. Fruits and grains are also transformed. For those of you who are familiar with the Christian Eucharist, you'll recognize that it's not wheat and grapes that are offered, but bread and wine. This transformation also parallels the transformation of nature into art. So the sacrificial impulse can be considered the beginnings of art. A third aspect of the phenomenology of the sacrifice has to do with control. The sacrificial altar lay at the center of a space consecrated as sacred. When ritual actions are performed in this area, often referred to as the sacrificial arena, the priest is understood to be attempting to manipulate cosmic forces. The sacrifice is then a miniature model or microcosm of the universe, which is the macrocosm. When the Brahmin priest, or as it developed, an entire team of Brahmin priests, performed the sacrifice, which is called a yajna, they performed the sacrifice for a Kshatriya ruler or a wealthy merchant who sponsored it. And the priest asks the god to bring wealth, often in the form of cows, victory in battle, abundant rain in the right season, abundant crops, healthy sons. After all, this was a male-oriented society. And a good death. A good death meant a glorious death in battle, or a comfortable old age and a nice resting place in heaven. So, as you can tell from this description, this early Vedic concept of the afterlife did not involve reincarnation. But in addition to what the priests were asking for their patrons, the priests themselves also wanted to invest their poetic hymns to the gods with powerful language to persuade the gods to do their will. They were very clear that creating powerful poetic language was as important to them as obtaining wealth for their patrons. They also believed that through the inspiration of the gods, and sometimes with the aid of mind-altering drugs, the sacrificial ritual would reveal itself as a key to the creation of the universe. And if the priests could see back to the beginning of time when the universe came into being, they could understand its structure and be better able to control it. Again, the microcosm of the sacrifice for the macrocosm of the universe. This is sometimes referred to as, quote-unquote, the dual agenda of the sacrifice, what the priests wanted alongside of what their patrons wanted. Now, I've gone into great detail about the sacrifice because its performance and everything that surrounded it had been central to life in ancient India for perhaps 1,000 years when the Buddha was born. Because of the central role of the Brahmins, they were able to define what religious and social life would be, what they called the Dharma. Because there were also sacrifices to maintain the well-being of ancestors who had already departed to the afterlife, the Brahmins regulated expectations about death as well as about life. But this was already starting to change in the 100 or so years before Gautama was born. Instead of the afterlife being understood as a heavenly reward, for many, life and death were beginning to be seen as an endless and tiring cycle of death and rebirth. Death and rebirth. We'll come back to this change shortly. And even though the world of the Vedic sacrifice was rich in symbolism and meaning, and even though it promised material rewards from the gods, the Buddha was going to reject it completely because it did not address the problem of existential and psychological human suffering. Now, Vedic sacrifice is no longer the primary expression of Hinduism as it was in the Buddha's time, but it still informs some of the deeper meanings of Hinduism. Probably the most striking aspect of life that the Brahmins shaped after the sacrificial ritual itself was the ancient Indian social structure today known as caste. The term for this in the classical languages of India, which was Sanskrit, is varna. This word is related through Indo-European to our word varnish, and it basically means color. Now, no one really knows entirely why this is the case, because when we look at the caste system, it doesn't rely on color differences alone. However, it may have been that at one time certain groups at the lower end of the caste system were darker than those at the top. As a social system, caste isn't markedly different from the social systems that we see in other parts of the world. After all, we form our opinions about which group someone belongs to by the color of their skin, the kind of work that they do, how quote-unquote clean we perceive them to be. In some cultures, people who are specialists in religious activity are deemed more pure or more holy than other people. And in many cultures, social class is more or less hereditary. Children tend to follow their parents' occupations in traditional societies. People do tend to socialize and marry within their own group. And all these features, found universally, are features of caste. The difference in Hindu culture is that these arrangements were codified in religious law books and somewhat enforced by both popular consensus and even by governments in ancient and colonial times. I spoke earlier about the word dharma in its Hindu sense of the right or religious obligation. The Hindu texts that prescribed behavior in accordance with dharma are called dharma shastras, and these books would be referred to for the proper behavior of people in different communities before modern times. Even with the dharma shastras, the phenomenon of caste was relatively fluid in pre-colonial times. When the British came, however, they interpreted what was in the Dharma Shastras as fixed, and in order to create efficient government, they built caste into the version of law they established in India. After independence, of course, the government of India outlawed prejudice on the basis of caste, but it still occurs. There are also affirmative action programs for people in disadvantaged castes. These are particularly directed to the people formerly called untouchables, now known as Dalits, or the oppressed. It's also worth noting that you'll find people from all groups in the entire spectrum of professions today, but there are still dominant occupations in some castes. Now, there are thousands of caste groups called jatis, but we're concerned with the four main groupings, the varnas. And these are the Brahmins, the priestly caste. As I said before, this community was also the keepers of the religious and the literary tradition in general. The Kshatriyas, merchants, rulers and warriors, Vaishyas, who are merchants, artisans, and farmers. The fourth group are the Shudras, who were generally landless laborers or peasants. The first three groups are called twice-born because the males of this group, especially the Brahmins, undergo a religious ceremony at the beginning of adolescence in which they are reborn, so to speak. Outside this fourfold community were the Dalits and members of tribal communities. Sometimes this system is referred to as quote-unquote a sacrificial sociology, at least in ancient times. The Brahmins, the purest, were in charge of the sacrifices, with the Kshatriyas as the patrons who paid for it. Vaishyas could be onlookers or hear the text of the Vedic hymns, but Shudras and all others were not considered ritually pure enough to see the sacrifice or hear the Vedas being chanted. Despite all the social features, such as occupation, etc., which demarcate caste, caste is fundamentally a notion of ritual purity. The higher the caste, the more quote-unquote pure it is, which means that it is more easily polluted in a symbolic sense than the lower castes. Anthropologists have observed that caste is marked by two features, endogamy and commensality. Endogamy means marrying within a group. Commensality means sharing food. Now, what's behind this? The idea is that people in your caste have the same symbolic essence that you have, so you can share bodily substances with them, which of course is what happens in marital relations and in eating. The vertical component of this is that you can never share your substance with someone lower on the scale, but someone higher on the scale can share their substance with you. Let me give you two examples. When you go to a very traditional Indian wedding, the food will often be prepared by Brahmins. Why? Because since Brahmins are the most pure, anyone can eat the food that they prepare. This is somewhat ironic since Brahmins are associated with occupations requiring a great deal of education. Nonetheless, less educated communities of Brahmins do work as cooks. Here's another example. When I was studying in India, I lived in a traditional neighborhood on a street that was mostly Brahmins. Just outside the street lived the low-caste sweepers who cleaned the houses. Every morning, the older, retired Brahmins would take a ritual bath to establish their purity before they visited the temple. But often, while they were walking down the street, the little low-caste kids would run in front of them so that their shadows would fall on the Brahmins. The Brahmins would feel that they had to go home again and bathe before setting out for the temple again. Now, most of the people in the neighborhood thought that this older generation of Brahmins was way over the top, and we all thought these kids were quite funny in exposing the way that the Brahmins followed the super strict rules. Now, this way of thinking about purity and essence might seem absurd or remote to us. But let's remember that before the 1960s, many states in the southern United States had laws that forbid people of African descent from using the same bathroom facilities as white people, as well as laws forbidding blacks and whites from marrying. The racist thinking behind these laws was that whites and blacks had different essences which should not be mixed. In fact, the laws against marriage were called anti-miscegenation laws. And anti-miscegenation means anti-race mixing laws. So, the effect of these rules was not just to keep people separate, but to promote the idea that people in different groups had a different essence. We'll see in ancient India that the Buddha rejected the idea of caste because he rejected the idea that people have essences. In the time of the Buddha, the caste arrangements were thought to be built into the very order of creation. There's a hymn in the Rig Veda, the most ancient and revered scripture of Hinduism, that tells how the universe was created through the sacrifice of a gigantic primal man. When this primal person was sacrificed, his head became the Brahmins, his shoulders the Kshatriyas, his thighs the Vaishyas, and his feet the Shudras. The top diagram illustrates the idea of this Vedic scripture. Now, by the time of the Buddha, although this Vedic hymn was still important, there was also the newer idea that you were born into a certain caste because of your deeds from a past life. That is, because of your karma. Basically, what we're saying is that because of the views promulgated in the Brahmins' religious literature, people at the time of the Buddha accepted that the Vedas were the word of the divine, and the caste system was ordained from the beginning of time. So you can imagine what a challenge it was to the way of life at his time for Gautama Buddha to assert that the Vedas were not divine or eternal, and that the caste system wasn't based on anything real. Now, the Buddha did not exist in a vacuum. During his era, the power of kings and wealthy merchants was on the increase, and the social system promoted by the Brahmins, while still pervasive, was somewhat losing its hold among these groups. There were others who were also challenging the Vedic worldview who were not part of the Buddhist community. So it wasn't just a revolutionary idea from the Buddha that challenged the caste system. The social structure, the economic structure, and the political structure also was being transformed during the time of Gautama. We'll see that all the different religious groups of the Buddha's time came to accept the idea of karma. That your deeds affected who you are as a person and also affected your future. But the Buddha thought that it was an individual matter, not a determining factor for which social group you were born into. The Buddha made a point of accepting people from all backgrounds into his new community. And you can see this illustration of the Buddha accepting this low-caste person, Sunita, who was a sweeper, or what we would call somebody like a garbage collector, into the Sangha. There's another story where the Buddha tells a new Brahmin member of the Sangha that he should take a whiff of what came out of his butt in the morning and see if it smelled any different from what came out of the butt of other people. Now, Hinduism, of course, continued alongside the rise of Buddhism. We know this because Hinduism still exists. And this means that caste still exists in modern times, even though it's outlawed in a way by the Indian legal system. During the 20th century, the Dalits, the oppressed people called untouchables, although they were still extremely disadvantaged as a group, the Dalits have become a strong political force. One of the great Dalit leaders, Dr. Ambedkar, encouraged Dalits to become Buddhists as a way of rejecting the caste system and a way of rejecting Hinduism in general, which he hated. Many Dalits did become Buddhists, although we'll see that Buddhism basically died out in India about 1,000 years ago. On the lower right, you'll see an image of the very successful female Dalit politician, Mayavati. Caste politics are huge in India today, the same way that ethnic politics are huge in many places in the United States. So minority Brahmins actually joined forces with minority Dalits to achieve a victory over the dominant party. That's pretty amazing, right? During the later Vedic age, about 700 to 400 BCE, which was also the general range in which the Buddha was born, we see the sacrifice both getting bigger and smaller. On the one hand, the great sacrifices that the Brahmins presided over became so elaborate that they required large teams of different types of ritual specialists and elaborate preparations costing a great deal of money. While the Brahmins performed simpler sacrifices at home, the public sacrifices were the province of the wealthy, although when they were performed under the patronage of the king, the entire kingdom was thought to benefit. On the other hand, certain communities of Brahmins began to take a less materialistic, even more spiritual view of the sacrifice. Instead of performing the actual physical sacrifice, they performed it as a spiritual exercise in their imaginations. After all, if there was a relationship between the microcosm of the sacrifice and the macrocosm of the universe, then an individual could see himself as containing the entire cosmos with his internal spirit, within his internal spirit. This also created the habit of looking within oneself to see oneself as having an inner life, a feature of Brahmin religion that had not existed within the Aryan tradition before. The term for this looking inward is interiority. During this period, a great mood shift seems to have overcome the thinkers and religious specialists of the subcontinent. From a basic acceptance of the world as it was and a desire to engage the gods for the goods of the world, we now start to see a dissatisfaction with the world as it is, a seeking for something beyond the world. Several theories have been put forth to explain this change. Some say that the modality of the sacrifice as a means of connecting with ultimacy had simply worn out, and seekers could no longer expect to use it as a tool to find meaning. Of course, sacrifices continued to be performed as great public spectacles to establish the power of the patron, but Brahmins found it less satisfactory for seeing into the nature of reality. A second theory is that the rise of cities and vigorous trade activity had created a kind of malaise or uneasiness with the predictable goals of the householder life. A more sophisticated version of this theory says that a whole series of political and economic changes were touched off by the rise of cities, which made the sacrifice seem less relevant and promoted interiority. Another theory is that the religion of the non-Aryan peoples, which was suppressed by the coming of the Aryans, had developed a kind of yoga that was inwardly focused, and that this yogic approach to life was becoming more prominent among certain groups of seekers. Finally, and we can't say whether this was a cause or an effect of the great mood shift, an entirely new idea about life and death arose. This was the notion that life is an endless cycle of birth and redeath, repeated over and over again. We touched on this idea before. The term that's used for this experience is samsara, which literally means cycling around. Although in Hinduism and Buddhism, this notion is understood literally by millions of people, it can also be understood symbolically. Samsara doesn't just refer to reincarnation. It refers to the sense of life as repetitive, trapped, and unliberated. I'm stressing this, and I'm really stressing this, because it would be easy to dismiss the entire reality of samsara by saying you don't believe in reincarnation. Whether or not you entertain the possibility that reincarnation is literally true, you can still enter into the worldview of samsara. And you need to do that to understand Buddhism. You need to understand this sense that life as we live it is limited. It's without freshness. As if there were some kind of blockage between us and the real truth of existence. We'll explore this notion of samsara more fully in a few minutes. At this point, let's talk briefly about the responses to this worldview. For most ordinary people, it simply meant trying to deal with the world as best as possible and to make life better. But for a group of people who were small in number, but turned out to be extremely influential, the reality of samsara prompted an aspiration to escape from this cycle, to be liberated from problematic worldly life. These people were broadly known as Shramanas. This term comes from a root which means to strive or to exert oneself. So Shramanas were people who exerted themselves, performing feats of spiritual striving to win liberation. Shramanas could be either orthodox, meaning they accepted the authority of the Vedas, the caste system, and the teachings of the Brahmins, or Shramanas could be non-orthodox, meaning they rejected the Vedas, they rejected Brahmanical authority, and they rejected the caste system. Just a little side note here, Trainer says that Shramana means wandering. It's true that Shramanas adopted a deliberately homeless and wandering lifestyle, but the word Shramana does not mean wandering. Shramanas are renunciants. Very important word. They are people who renounce the normal, everyday way of living to seek spiritual liberation. During the period we're talking about, it seems that thousands of people left the expected life of marriage, family, and work to live in communities in the forests outside the cities, or to live alone as religious hermits. Many of these groups were centered around a guru, or a teacher. Sometimes the teacher was kind of a holy figure who spent a great deal of time in silence. Such a figure was called Muni, or silent one. And we'll see that that term will come back as a name for the Buddha. In addition to seeking wisdom, many of them used the techniques of what we now call yoga, physical exercises, breathing exercises, and they used forms of meditation to discover the real that lay behind the world of appearances. From our vantage point, we can say that all these groups were experimenting not only with the limits of consciousness, but with the limits of the mind-body relationship. Although not part of the mainstream, the ideas that the renunciants developed and the ways of life that they established became extremely important for Indian culture and philosophy. Although most people did not pursue this extreme search for liberation or a radically renunciant way of life, a great deal of the society agreed that these people were doing what they themselves wished they could do, The renunciants were thought to understand the true nature of reality and were usually highly respected. The renunciants who stayed within the Hindu mainstream, who renounced the world but accepted the Vedas and the caste system, again were called the orthodox renunciants. The teachers and students who gave us the Upanishads, are the great texts of dialogues between gurus and students, which came to be considered the concluding part of the Vedas. But, as I said, many of these Shramanas did not accept the authority of the Vedas, and the Brahmins who were the keepers of the Vedic tradition. These non-orthodox Shramanas included the Buddha and his followers. Another important renunciant group were called the Jains. Some scholars think it was the Jain teachers who were the first vegetarians in ancient India and who developed the first idea of karma. These two ideas go together, of course, since killing produces the worst sort of karma, and avoiding killing animals for food is part of the path to spiritual liberation. The top image on this slide shows a contemporary Hindu renouncer. This man was an IT guy at a global firm in India. He renounced his social position and his modern lifestyle to seek the truth. The bottom image, of course, is a Buddhist monk, another type of renouncer. All the renunciant groups, Orthodox, which at this point we can call Hindu, and non-Orthodox, accepted the worldview of the reality of samsara and the causes of samsara. Why does samsara exist? The sages of ancient India during this period believed that it simply existed since the beginning of time, actually before the beginning of time, since there were numerous time cycles before the present one that we're living in. After all, when you look at much of the plant world, it seems to die and be reborn. So isn't the idea of death and rebirth in some ways more natural than the idea of simply dying or dying into a reward or punishment? But their analysis went further, into the psychological mechanisms which sustain samsara. The chief mechanism is karma, which means action. The idea is that all actions have an effect, an idea accepted universally. The difference in the Indian idea of karma is that the effect is not only external to the actor, but internal as well. In other words, the actions you perform have an effect on who you become. Karma is related to the English word create, so by good actions or good karma, you create a good you, and by bad actions, you create a not-so-good you. This is totally different from the passive notion of fate. Karma puts your future into your hands. Karma builds up, and at the end of your life, it still exists. So after a brief period, the karma seeks another birth in which to work itself out. Of course, in this next birth, there's going to be more karma accrued, so samsara keeps going. But why does karma, good or bad, work? Why should actions create sticky results, so to speak? Karma is fueled by ignorance and desire. When we perform actions, we invest those actions with desire for results. And that kind of desire or craving, even if it's mild, is what gives actions their karmic stickiness. Further, most of us live in this fog of desire, and we don't even look within to analyze our wants and our fantasies, how these wants and fantasies are driving most of our actions. So this ignorance of our own dissatisfied, craving natures gives karma its power, and ultimately sustains samsara, the cycling around or reincarnation. But if there is a possibility of good karma, does that sustain samsara as well? Yes. Ultimately, even good karma is not desirable. Because even though for most people the prospect of a better life in the next birth is welcomed, it still means being trapped in the cycle of rebirth. Psychologically, this is a way of saying that even though life can be made comfortable and quote-unquote nice, that doesn't make it spiritually liberated. As I said, in the India of the 5th century BCE, the world of samsara, sustained by good and bad karma, by ignorance and by desire, was shared by the orthodox Hindu Shramanas and the non-orthodox Shramanas, and eventually it spread from the world of the religious counterculture of the forest communities into the mainstream. Today, karma and samsara are bedrocks of both Hindu and Buddhist worldviews. For the Hindu sages of the Upanishads, the solution to samsara was a kind of profound liberating knowledge called jnana. Through analysis of the nature of reality, the sages of the Upanishads found underneath the world of appearances there lay a fundamental spiritual reality called Brahman. This word shouldn't be confused with the name of the Brahmin caste, although those two words are related. These sages also discovered that through yogic meditation, within each person lies a spiritual self that is permanent and unchanging. Unlike the psychological personality, which is constantly growing, shifting, and changing. They called this spiritual self the Atman. This term is sometimes translated as soul, but a better translation is simply self, an enduring spiritual essence. For these sages, liberation comes when the individual is able to profoundly know Brahman and to realize that the individual Atman is identical with the cosmic Brahman. Now, you might think that this would be the foundation for all spiritual thought and practice, and it became that for Hindu philosophy. But, just to give you a preview of the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha completely rejects the idea of the existence of a permanent, unchanging self. Just as he rejects the authority of the Vedas, just as he rejects the teaching of the Brahmins, just as he rejects the idea of the caste system. The Buddha says that we create the fantasy of an unchanging self as something to hold on to. And because this fantasy of a self, or an Atman, is the product of ignorance and desire, rather than liberating us from samsara, the idea of a self pulls us further into the cycle of transmigration. On this slide, the top image shows an ancient Hindu renunciant teacher imparting the wisdom of a permanent transcendent self to his student. The bottom image is the Buddha teaching the wisdom of accepting impermanence to the monks in his first community.